Arriving in town, memories of my past weighed heavily on my mind. Everything had changed since I left, and not necessarily for the better. Regrets from years ago lingered as I checked into a small motel, gripping a bottle of bourbon. It had become my only companion during lonely nights. As I settled in, returning to this town felt like opening Pandora's box, filled with painful memories. The bourbon slowly numbed my thoughts until a loud knock on the door startled me. Fumbling for a moment, I cautiously asked, "Who is it?" "Alex?" a gruff voice called out. "It's Mr. Anderson." Surprised, I opened the door, and Mr. Anderson stepped in. "Mr. Anderson?" I stammered. "Alex," he said softly. "I need your help." Curiosity grew as we sat in my motel room. I offered him a drink, but he declined, remembering my past struggles with alcohol. He explained, "Alex, I know you left town on bad terms, but I have nowhere else to turn. It's about Jake's accident. I think there's more to it. You might be the only one I can trust to find the truth." "I'm no detective," I replied. "Not sure what I can do." "You still have friends in this town," he insisted. "And you must know the secrets." We talked for hours, and when he left, I felt a newfound purpose. I put the bourbon away, untouched, and lay down on the bed, fatigue from the journey taking over. Dressed in somber funeral attire, I prepared for Jake's funeral. But an uneasy feeling settled in. Reuniting with old friends felt bittersweet, especially Emily. We had nearly married, but our friendship soured when I discovered her affair with Mark, Jake's friend, which caused our breakup. As I entered the cemetery, grief hung in the air like a shroud. A small cluster of mourners gathered, their faces heavy with sorrow. I noticed Mr. Anderson, Jake's father, near the casket, casting suspicious glances at Emily and Mark. Their strained interactions deepened the mystery. Approaching Emily was daunting. She avoided eye contact and hissed, "What do you want?" when I greeted her. "I just want to offer my condolences," I replied, trying to keep the peace. Her "thank you" sounded more like a snarl. The funeral proceeded solemnly, but beneath the facade of grief, I sensed something amiss in this small town. The day after Jake's funeral, an urgency to uncover the truth gnawed at me. I reached out to Jake's firefighter colleagues who had been at the fire. They shared stories of his bravery and revealed a strained relationship between Jake and Mark, his best friend, with heated arguments and a falling out. It was becoming clear that their turmoil might be connected to Jake's tragedy. As I left the fire station, my mind raced with questions. The strained relationship between Jake and Emily and the falling out with Mark played on my mind. Determination to find answers grew stronger. Suspects were building up, adding complexity to the mystery. An unfaithful wife, a bitter falling out with his best friend. These were the threads I needed to follow. I strolled into a small diner across the road from my motel room, seeking a moment of respite. A friendly waitress approached, and my eyes widened as I recognized her. "Hello, Alex," she said warmly. "Remember me?" "Sarah?" I replied, memories of our youth flooding my mind. "You're back for Jake's funeral?" she inquired with sorrow in her voice. "Yes," I replied, my thoughts returning to the painful reality. I reached out and asked her to join me during her break. As we sat together, we reminisced about better times. Sarah confided, "I wish I had left this town." Her revelation caught me off guard, considering her popularity in high school. She left for her shift, but before departing, she leaned over and whispered, "If you need company when you leave town again," kissing my cheek. I was left in a state of disbelief and confusion as she walked away, her smile broadening. I decided to visit the scene of the fire, hoping to uncover answers amid the charred remnants of the burned-out cabin. As I arrived at the desolate location, the air was thick with the lingering scent of smoke and regret. The cabin, once Jake and Emily's weekend retreat, now stood as a grim testament to the tragedy that had unfolded here. Kneeling down to examine the ashes and debris, my heart sank as I found little more than charred remains. Just as despair threatened to take hold, a glimmer of hope emerged. A partially burned diary, hidden beneath a pile of debris, caught my eye. With trembling hands, I carefully retrieved it. The final entry, partially scorched, read, "I've got myself into so much debt. Jake must..." A sudden sharp thud on the back of my head sent my world spiraling into darkness. When I finally regained consciousness, the diary had vanished, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was clear that I was treading on perilous ground. and the secrets I sought were fiercely guarded by unknown forces. As I left the burned-out cabin, stumbling back to my rental car, my head throbbing, that's when I noticed something under the windshield wiper, a folded note. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The message, stark and chilling, was written in capital letters, "Leave town." A shiver raced down my spine. As I nervously scanned my surroundings, the nagging feeling I'd had since I arrived in town intensified. I sensed that I was being watched, that every shadow concealed unseen eyes, and every rustle of leaves carried a sinister whisper. Someone was resolute about keeping me from the truth, and the peril I had unwittingly walked into was now unmistakably real. I started the car, fully aware that I had to tread cautiously if I wanted to uncover the deeply hidden secrets. Alone in my dimly lit motel room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the diary I had discovered held the key to unraveling the mysteries within its scorched pages. The final entry taunted me, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. I closed my eyes, concentrating, trying to make sense of it all. Memories from the past flashed through my mind, and ideas began to emerge. Sarah's casual mention of Emily and Mark being in the diner the day of the fire stood out. They had seemed guilty, and I recalled them saying, "It's dangerous," which we had mistaken for a reference to volunteer fire duties. Then there was Mr. Andrews, talking about insurance payouts for Emily and Mark's comforting presence. Could it have been an insurance job gone wrong? Suspicion washed over me. Was it possible that Jake was involved in his own death? It would explain a lot. As I connected the dots, the mysterious diary, insurance payouts, the room seemed to spin around me. Exhaustion finally overcame me, and I collapsed onto the bed, surrendering to sleep, haunted by unsettling possibilities. I awoke to Emily's soft voice in the sunlight streaming through my motel room window. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she spoke. "Alex, it was an accident." "I assumed as much," I replied calmly. "The cabin insurance money was meant to clear our debts." Emily turned away, sobbing into her hands. "It was Jake's idea," she said, trying to compose herself. "Jake and Mark almost fell out over it when Jake told him of his plan. Jake got trapped when the roof collapsed," she said tearfully. "Mark had to be held back from running into the fire." I pulled her close, comforting her as she sobbed. She pleaded, "Please, Alex, let Jake rest in peace. Mark had nothing to do with it. He was trying to talk Jake out of it." I pressed further, asking about the person who hit me over the head. Emily hesitated before revealing. "Mark did. He was protecting me." My voice sharpened as I asked about their discussion in the diner. Emily's fear was palpable. She demanded to know how I knew about it, growing increasingly frantic. In a moment of anger and frustration, she screamed at me to leave town. As she collapsed into a chair sobbing, the door flew open, and Mark stormed in, his fists raining down on me. "Why didn't you just leave town?" Mark's voice seethed with anger as he pounded me. "Everything could have been forgotten, and you could have lived your miserable life elsewhere." As I began to lose consciousness under the barrage of blows, a woman's scream pierced the air. As I regained consciousness, I found myself in a bright white hospital room, greeted by a smiling Mr. Anderson. "Don't try to get up," he advised gently. Another familiar face was in the room, Sarah. She sat beside me, holding my hand, her gentleness a welcome contrast to the ordeal I had endured. "I've been so worried about you," Sarah expressed her concern. "Sarah's been at your side all day," Mr. Andrews added, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Confused, I asked what had happened. Mr. Andrews began to explain that Sarah had been on her way to see me when she noticed Emily entering my motel room, followed by Mark sitting in a car. Sarah interrupted, admitting she had felt a bit jealous. She continued, her female intuition kicking in when she saw Mark burst into my room. She ran to the checkout desk to call the police while witnessing Mark and Emily speeding away from my room. "There is an arrest warrant out for them, Alex," Mr. Andrews confirmed. I pieced it together and asked if it was an insurance scam gone wrong. "Afraid so, Alex," Mr. Andrews replied. "And poor Jake had no idea about Mark and Emily's affair," he added, struggling to keep his composure. A nurse entered the room, signaling that it was time for me to rest. Sarah kissed me gently and said her goodbyes. Mr. Andrews expressed his gratitude as they both left my room. The next day, I was discharged from the hospital, and Mr. Andrews was waiting for me outside. He explained that Mark and Emily had been arrested. Emily had confessed to helping Mark stage the fire at the cabin, and Mark had confessed to killing Jake by tampering with his breathing gear. "Jake had nothing to do with any of it?" I asked. Not directly, Mr. Andrews added regretfully. Jake thought up the cabin fire, but Mark and Emily took it a step too far. As we arrived at the motel, a smiling Sarah greeted me. Mr. Andrews bid us farewell with a laugh, and we shook hands. I thanked him for his help. Sarah wrapped her arms around my neck, expressing concern for my well-being. We entered my room briefly, but she had to leave for work, apologizing for her lateness. I mentioned my impending departure that afternoon, surprising Sarah. She looked saddened by the news. "I guess not," she replied, a hint of regret in her tone. She hurried off to work, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Back in my room, I scolded myself for not staying longer to get to know Sarah. I packed my belongings, paid the motel bill, and loaded my rental car. As I walked to my car, my eyes widened, and a smile crossed my face. Sarah was sitting on my car with a holdall beside her. We hugged and kissed in excitement, and without looking back, we left the small town together, our destination uncertain.